Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsey Swierk, and I am a behavioral ecologist and an assistant professor at SUNY Binghamton. What a behavioral ecologist does is study how animal behavior, why animal behavior is the way it is, given an animal's environment. These lizards, they're called water anoles. They're pretty small. Their bodies are not much bigger than maybe your biggest finger. And so everything tries to eat them, little tasty nuggets. And they have this really cool way of evading predators. They live only on the sides of these small streams and waterfalls. And when they get targeted by a predator, what they do is they end up jumping from those little rocks on the sides of the stream into the water. And then they dive underwater and then they stay there. And that's the key thing. They stay there long enough that their predators get bored or they find something better to eat. And they can stay there a really long time. Um, we clocked the greatest length of time around 20 minutes. Um, But we do think that they possibly could stay underwater longer. And they actually can stay underwater that long because they have this really cool adaptation where their skin basically traps air and they can use that air trapping skin to form a bubble over their head. And when they form a bubble over their head, they're actually able to breathe it in and out. And we can measure the oxygen in the bubble and we can see that as they're breathing it in and out, they're actually using up some of that oxygen that's in that little scuba tank. Um, and that allows them to stay underwater for these really long periods. We prevented them from blowing bubbles in one treatment, and we allowed them to blow bubbles in the other treatment. So we did this by putting a substance on their skin that made their skin not trap air anymore. So while they would still dive, they couldn't rebreathe that bubble of air over their head. And what we found there in these tanks is that lizards that could rebreathe that bubble were able to stay underwater longer than lizards that couldn't. And therefore, we can. This tells us that that bubble actually has a function, and that function is allowing them to stay under longer. We predicted that, like some insects, these lizards might be pulling oxygen that's dissolved in the water out of the water through their bubble and using that in their breathing. And we had three different types of tanks set up. One tank was just regular water. One tank had water with very little oxygen in it. And then the third tank had water where we were bubbling oxygen in, so there was a lot of oxygen in that water. And then we allowed the lizards to dive in each of these three types of tanks. And what we found is that when all else was equal, the lizards that were in the tank with a lot of oxygen in that water were also diving for longer, which seems to imply that in some way, maybe through diffusion of that oxygen from the water into the air bubble, lizards are extracting oxygen from the water. Obviously, these lizards would love to just sort of hang out in their preferred habitat on these nice rocks near the water kind of all the time. They eat insects. They also defend their territories by dewlapping and they look for mates. But when predators come around, they have to do something. So their first line of defense is actually just to run away and hide in like a rock crevice. If that still doesn't work, that's when you see them jumping into the water and diving. Um, and that is their last resort, really, because when they dive, these streams are fairly chilly. And lizards are ectotherms, so they're very dependent on their environment for their body temperatures. So when they're diving, they're getting colds, their metabolism could slow down, and when they reemerge, because their body temperature is lower, they might not be able to run away quite as quick as they would otherwise. So there's a trade-off. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking. I grew up in the suburbs in New Jersey, and my exposure to wildlife was pretty much limited to the birds I saw in my backyard. And I also had some pet lizards when I was first, second, third grade, somewhere in there. Um, so I think I was always interested in just watching what animals did. So I would just kind of look at them and try to figure out why they were doing what they were doing. And at that age, at a very young age, I had no idea you could make a career out of this. I did not even know that people were researching this sort of topic. So I had never planned to become what I currently am. There was a lot of serendipity involved. There was a lot of just curiosity and asking people questions when I got to high school and college.